He was also the Assistant Commissioner of the New South Wales Commission Against Corruption, and also currently the Chair of the Management Committee on the New South Wales Crime Commission and Chair of Buck Academy Australia. Please welcome Anthony Whealy, please.
Please note the last chairmanship, which shows that I'm deeply involved in classical music and things artistic and cultural. Anyway, leaving all that to one side, the Corruption Perception Index, published by Transparency International Australia, for a number of years showed a decline, a slide down the slippery slope, as our international perceptions of Australia's battle with corruption deteriorated rapidly. This year, the slide stopped and we actually went up slightly. And I've got no doubt that the reason for that was twofold. One, a change of government, and B, the resolution to form a national anti-corruption body. Now, we've just stopped the decline, but will it start again, is the question I ask. And will the factor equivalent to the absence of an anti-corruption body over the last 10 years, will the new factor be an absence of integrity in climate policy? That's the question I think we'll be asking ourselves. From my point of view, I'm not an expert in climate policy. I'm, I guess, an amateur, and an enthusiastic amateur, you would say. But I find the science perplexing, and I think in many ways the way in which governments and the fossil fuel industry push out the information to us, it's meant to be perplexing. The more perplexing it is, the more we're likely to shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, I suppose it's okay. And so that's, and the Centre for Public Integrity, while it embraces a number of matters, it hasn't embraced climate policy, but that's because other people do it so well. And we stand in admiration of the Australia Institute and other organisations that are very concerned on this very important issue. But even though we're not directly involved, we firmly embrace the broad concept of integrity in every aspect of government administration and decision making, and that includes on climate policy. And some of the aspects that the last speaker mentioned, which I agree with entirely, were honesty, transparency, accountability. They're all the things that we come to expect as aspects of integrity. You know, the Anti-Corruption Commission, now it's formed, is terrific, but it's really just a fallback. It's not really the heart of integrity. It's really a safeguard mechanism designed to check whether integrity is taking place or not taking place in public administration. So let's not fool ourselves that that's the end of the battle. So we look at government appointments. This is one that we feel really strongly about. We think that appointment making is not impartial, it's not independent, it's not transparent, and it's entirely in need of a complete overhaul. We believe that the role of the public service requires, as the Thody report said, considerable overhaul. It became just an adjunct to government policy and government decision making, and lost its capacity to give frank and fearless advice, and that's got to be addressed as well. Another big issue, to my way of thinking, perhaps the biggest, is the influence of big money in political decision making. We all know that the donation system at a federal level is entirely uncontrolled in every major respect. We know that campaign spending is unfettered. We know that there's a lack of transparency. And what we really know, what is at the heart of it, is that this evil of large money in donation making is a way in which corporate and private interests get access to government and therefore influence government in their decision making. And don't let's fool ourselves that doesn't happen. Nobody gives thousands and thousands of dollars to governments in donations without expecting something in return. Are we so stupid that we don't realise that? Sometimes I think we are. And so when the donation analysis is made, as our centre has done, we come away absolutely gobsmacked to see the capacity for big money to influence governments, and I'm sure that that's what's happening. And we are not yet addressing it at all at federal level. We need truth in political advertising. We need strong whistleblower protection in the public sphere. We need particularly to make sure that conflicts of interest are avoided, are recognised first of all, instead of being applauded. I'll probably have something to say a bit more about that in a minute. But and finally, let me just say, or perhaps two final things. One, the secrecy surrounding government decision making is appalling. We saw it for years under the coalition government. I don't want to see it repeated again. It's so easy to slip into cabinet confidence and all those sort of things. It's depressing that we're shut out from understanding what governments do and why they do it. And the final thing is our reliance on experts. I mean, particularly in the field of climate policy, there are a lot of experts, and a lot of experts have got different opinions. And I mean, that can be a good thing, it can be a bona fide thing. But, you know, I come from a system of the courts where experts were commonly used, and I became very suspicious of expert evidence because what you realise is that Party A calls an expert, lo and behold, the expert agrees entirely with Party A's position, and Party B does the same thing. What am I to make of it? These are experts. But, you know, I think we have to be very careful in our reliance on experts. Yes, by all means, look at what experts say, but let's not accept things at face value. Let's just see how scientific and useful those expert opinions really are. Again, I think that's to do with integrity. It's only a small aspect of integrity, but it's important. Well, there we are.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
I probably
next up, we have Dr. Monique Ryan, MP. She's the independent member for Kooyong. You might famously remember beat the treasurer at the last election. Thrashed him, yeah. She's the first woman and first independent ever to hold the seat, and was elected on a platform of action on climate change, integrity in government, gender equity and healthcare. She's also an amazing medical expert, formerly director of the neurology department at the Royal Children's Hospital of Melbourne. But today we're going to talk to her about climate and integrity. Thank you, Dr. Monique Ryan.
So it's wonderful to be here, and firstly, let me acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal land which has been ceded to us, and then we are here at the pleasure of the original owners. To me, integrity and climate action are two sides of the same coin. If we talk about integrity as being absolutely essential to public perceptions, to our actions and our success in government, I think we've seen that our actions in response to the climate change crisis has reflected the lack of integrity in public institutions generally in recent years. What we've seen in many cases has been that the marketing of misinformation has triumphed science. Obviously, it has not been limited to climate. One of my areas of particular interest and frustration in recent years has been our global response to COVID. And what we've seen is in our response to COVID vaccinations and other aspects of pandemic management has reflected the fact that people have had an incredible erosion of trust in our institutions. And that's been accompanied, unfortunately, by a really kind of frightening superficiality and the level of public discourse, and by a complete loss of bipartisanship in politics. And that has been to all of our country. I think at this point, our ability to affect climate change and to affect action on it in a real way is going to be very much contingent on our ability to bring the public with us. And that's one of the challenges at a time when the public no longer trust politicians, government or science. I do think, though, that there's hope. I think that we are at the darkest hour. That the darkest hour, as we know, is generally just before dawn. What we have seen in recent years has been that scientists have stepped away from the bench top because they felt compelled to do so, and have taken to the streets. We've heard Indigenous peoples become louder and louder in their speech about this issue, even though we continue to deny them a voice. We've seen in electorates like Kooyong, Mackellar, Curtin, North Sydney, Warringah, Brisbane, Griffith, Ryan, and the ACT Senate, we've seen communities come together in a way that has been unprecedented in Australian history. And I can tell you that in Kooyong, the thing that drove people to come and to take action against the government, there were three reasons. Climate, and climate. It was extraordinary. The people who came to help me, and you know, I'm not a politician, so take everything I say now. No, but the people who came out were incredibly well educated. I said I had the best educated, best looking team of volunteers in the country. But they were people who'd never done, all of us, none of us had ever done anything like this before. I heard that expression once, I heard it 1,000 times in 2022. I've never done anything like this before, but I felt compelled. And I think many of us, we did what we did because we felt the need for change. Last week I spoke in the chamber about the voice, and I quoted a quote from Mark Twain, which I quite like. In 1897, he said that Australian history does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lies. And I said, it's time for us to tell the truth. We need to do it about our response to our First People, but also we need to talk truth about climate. I'm not a scientist, climate scientist either, but I've learned a lot in the last 2 years, and I've had incredible help and support from many people who are experts on all the things that I and the other members of the crossbench need to know. And what we do need in this 47th Parliament is for people like yourself to work with the crossbench, because we have to force the government and the coalition to some form of integrity in its response to climate change. And for mine, I think we have to bring science, and we have to bring accountability to our government and all of its dealings, and that's what I hope to do in the next 3 years.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Kieran Pender, who's a senior lawyer at the Human Rights Law Centre, leading its work in particular on whistleblower protections. He's also an honorary lecturer at the ANU College of Law and an award-winning journalist. Please welcome Kieran Pender.
Hi everyone. I'll also begin by acknowledging that we're on a war in the Ebony land, and that land was never ceded, and that this is a particularly important year for progress in recognition and reconciliation. I want to begin with a question, which is, how do we know about climate harm? How do we know about environmental damage? How do we know about climate inaction? We know about Australia's lack of progress. We know about policies that aren't working. We know about damage being caused to our environments and ecosystems because of scientists and researchers, because of journalists and academics, and because of whistleblowers. Brave people who speak up about wrongdoing that they see in their workplace. But what don't we know? I don't think it's hyperbolic to suggest that there are policies that are failing to address climate that we don't know about. There are inefficiencies and failures in our systems. There are regulators that are not fulfilling their functions. And perhaps most alarming of all, there are companies that are damaging the environment and damaging the climate and covering it up. So what I wanted to talk about today is, how do we empower brave Australians in their workplace who see wrongdoing to say something, to speak up? And then how do we ensure that those people are protected and empowered, not punished for their bravery? Because unfortunately, far too often in Australia and in other countries, brave people who speak up about wrongdoing suffer. And we've had, albeit not in the climate environment context in the last few years, a number of horrendous examples. We've had Bernard and Witness K speaking up about wrongdoing in Timor. We've had David McBride speaking up about war crimes in Afghanistan. We've had Richard Boyle speaking up about wrongdoing at the Australian Taxation Office. And all four of them were prosecuted for their truth-telling, for their bravery. So in that context, it should be no surprise that far too many Australians who see wrongdoing in their workplace are staying silent. And we don't know about the totality of the climate inaction and harm and environmental damage that's occurring because brave people are staying silent in the face of those concerns, those very well-founded concerns. So what do we do about it? I wanted to talk about the current potential, the need for greater support for whistleblowers, and then the reform possibilities ahead. So to begin with potential, notwithstanding those concerns about the current climate around whistleblowers, I do think we are in an era where we'll have more and more people speaking up about climate and environmental harm, and that the existing systems and laws and institutions will empower them. I think we've reached a tipping point. We've seen in recent years, we've seen just towards the end of last year in this Parliament, Andrew Wilkie using parliamentary privilege to speak up about fraud in coal testing. I think we will begin to see more and more whistleblowers, everyday people, could be any of you who in your workplaces see wrongdoing, see climate impact, and choose to speak up, whether they go to a crossbencher and avail the protection of privilege, whether they use federal whistleblowing law or state whistleblowing law to speak up. Even notwithstanding the flaws in current law, both the federal public sector and federal private sector whistleblowing laws empower people to speak up about wrongdoing, and particularly in relation to environmental harm. So a public servant or a private sector employee could go to the media tomorrow if they see and have concerns in their workplace about substantial and imminent danger to the natural environment. Now, there are questions about what that means, the extent to which it encompasses climate harm and so on, but we already have some of the tools we need to protect and empower people to speak up. So, we need to actually help them do that. The Human Rights Law Centre in the coming months will be launching a whistleblowing project where we protect and empower whistleblowers. We give them pro bono legal advice to help them speak up. We've been very fortunate to secure some funding and some pro bono commitments from leading law firms and barristers to do that. We'll be launching in the coming months. That will empower whistleblowers to speak up as safely and lawfully as possible. And we're going to have a focus on climate and environmental whistleblowing. So I think we've seen in recent years the beginning of a movement of brave people speaking up about climate and environmental harm in their workplaces. And I hope that our project will supercharge that movement. This year and the years ahead will also be critical for law reform. Our whistleblowing laws are not working, and so we need to fix them. We're going to see public sector reform this year, private sector reform hopefully next year, potential for a whistleblower protection authority. There's scope for innovation. In the US, they have reward schemes for whistleblowers. Imagine if we had a reward scheme for people who spoke up about dodgy carbon credits. Carbon credits that are a fraud on the government and a fraud on the population. And what we could unleash if we rewarded people for telling us that. It works in the US, it could work here. But I think most of all of us need to do what we can to protect and empower the brave people who speak up. Because the tale of a whistleblower too often is a tale of loneliness, it's a tale of isolation. So we need to come around and support people who have the courage to speak up about wrongdoing, because that will be a critical aspect of driving climate action.
Thank you. So we've had three really interesting perspectives on climate and integrity. Anthony, Whealy, I just wondered if you could give us a bit of a temperature check on where we're at with governance and democracy when it comes to, I guess, some of the barriers to integrity when it comes to climate change policy. So you've spoken a little bit about political donations, which I think often take the headlines, but we've also heard about political appointments in key agencies. And I'm also thinking of things in the legal arena like harsh anti-protest laws, which seem to be very much directed at climate protesters and things like that. So in terms of climate policies and the barriers to integrity there, what would be some of your key concerns?
Well, I'd repeat the ones that I mentioned first of all, perhaps giving them a greater emphasis. You know, I think you start at the beginning and you say, well, whoever you appoint to bodies that are there to administer climate policy, there has to be a better system of making sure those people are not just representing the fossil fuel industry, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, so we've got, for example, I know that the Climate Change Authority is chaired by a former gas executive who's also the chair of a very large carbon offset developer. You've mentioned earlier some concerns around conflicts of interest. Can you just explain to the audience the nature of those? Why is that a problem? And I guess what can we do about it?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this sort of problem. The first is you can appoint someone to a position and they will be avowedly out to promote either their own interests or the interest of an allied association. And that will be obvious to everyone. And they go ahead and do just that. So that's a conflict of interest working beautifully. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often. It's often more subtle than that. So the difficulty is trying to uncover and see that conflict of interest in operation. And that's why we have now an anti-corruption commission that's soon to be launched, because it will no doubt be looking, or it may be looking at situations where that type of conflict of interest exists, but is hard to find. So you've got to dig underneath with special powers to be able to see it happening. But there is, I think, a worse situation. Really, I know we're not talking about personalities here, but let me assume that in the hypothetical example you've given me, the head of this body was a person who avowedly says, I'm interested in net zero by 2050. I'm interested in reducing carbon emissions. So, and let's assume also this person is himself, from all accounts, a person of great integrity and well regarded in the commercial world. Nevertheless, the perception that he will be or may be acting to further those interests will arise. I mean, it does arise. Everybody talks about it. He would defend it and say, I'm not. And there are plenty of commentators who says, this is a terrible thing. And of course, the real problem is how he was appointed, because we don't have a proper appointment system. So there he is, and there's a perception. And I had this remark to make about Michelle Rowland the other day, who took a big donation from the gambling industry. The trouble with that sort of perception of a conflict of interest is it's going to dog you every step of the way, so that every decision you make, whether it's to do with climate policy or the gambling industry or whatever, even though it might appear to have some good aspects to it, there'll always be people who legitimately say there are situations where the fossil fuel industry is being preferred or advantaged, and that conflict leads to an absolute distrust on the part of the community in the whole system. And that's the real danger of conflicts of interest in government appointments, that it brings about a situation where the community deepen their distrust of the political class. I'm sorry. You're there? I know. And so I think I think really this question of public appointments and conflicts of interest can be so easily fixed. Of course, you have to have a lot of red tape. Governments don't like red tape, but you've got to have a panel that's truly independent, that will make a recommendation of 3 shortlisted candidates, and the minister has no discretion to go outside of those candidates. That's what you don't want.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for the list, but I've got to make it. I think it'd make it much better.
And of course, red tape is otherwise known as effective regulation.
Exactly.
Protection for the community. Monique, Ryan, obviously we've got the safeguard mechanism debate coming up very soon. We've heard some key concerns today. We've also talked about the fact the government's got a lot to do after a decade of inaction. Do you have any concerns around this legislation coming up, or the government's approach to making sure that its targets have integrity at the moment with what's facing you in the Parliament?
Oh, look, unfortunately, I think there's great cause for concern around the safeguards mechanism. Like many of the pieces of legislation that have been brought to this Parliament has been pushed through really quickly. Although the government has repeatedly avowed its intention not to muzzle debate in the House, it's done that on a number of occasions, most egregiously last week with the re-registration of the regional processing centre. That was just perverse and appalling. I'm still furious. You know, they brought up the recertification of the room, gave us an hour to see the legislation, and then gave us an hour to debate it before forcing it through the House. The same thing's going to happen with the safeguard mechanism. A number of us have come up with potential amendments for it, but we haven't been told about the rules of the debate. Even this week, I just spoke to the Public Interest Disclosure Act this morning. Yeah, they put it in a side chamber for a short period of time, that debate. There's real concerns about our ability to get through the amendments that we want to push through. Obviously, things are different in the Senate than they are in the House, but even in the Senate, there's a lot of pressure on people to acquiesce to things or to bundle things up or to make compromises that perhaps we don't want to make.
And that rush is quite counter to how the government has approached things like the secure jobs, better pay, you know, the big jobs roundtable that they had, that was all quite public.
You know, even that bill, we were given less than a week to look at a bill that was 623 pages long with a 200-page explanatory memorandum. I mean, it's just, you know, and incredibly detailed omnibus bill. And again, you know, the only people who got into the House to talk to us about that were the lobbyists.
Yeah.
And then you go back to the streets of Kieran, and people say, well, you said you were going to, you know, talk to us, you were going to ask people what they thought, you were going to take our opinions to Parliament, and the reality was that I didn't have that opportunity.
Yeah.
So I think unfortunately, there are real concerns about the safeguard mechanism. It's by no means a perfect piece of legislation. You know, as we've heard, you know, there's holes in it that you could drive a coal truck through, and it's good. I'm not sure how many changes we'll be able to make in the House. Also, the government's being a bit sneaky in things that they say, oh, what about this, what about this, what about this, and they say, that's a great idea, but we'll deal with that when we get to the Senate, because they're saving up the bonus to give to the people in the Senate, which is really frustrating.
Yeah.
So, but if and when we get the balance of power, things will be different.
Well, it's such an important point to make, because as Richard was saying, you know, these are all democratic questions, essentially, and we did see a real sea change at the last federal election. Kieran, coming to you next, I'm just really struck by the outline that you gave around whistleblower protections and how important that is going to be. It did make me think of the recent kind of the things that we've been hearing about robo-debt and the way that program went so wrong, not only from the ministerial level, but also within the public service. You talked about the fact that you think this is going to be more and more important as more people come forward spotting problems. How much does that apply to the public service in itself and its obligations under the Public Service Act?
Sure. Almost every Australian employee has whistleblower protection rights under law, but public servants have particular rights, particularly federal public servants have a whole law, the Public Interest Disclosure Act, currently being amended in the House, that empowers them to speak up about wrongdoing, internally, to regulators, to oversight bodies, and then to the media, to MPs, to senators, to anyone, really, if things aren't addressed. Robo-debt, I think, was a really vivid example of so many failures of process, and all I kept thinking was, why did no one speak up? And I know that there were a few murmurs here and there, and during the Royal Commission we had a brave person who spoke up internally, who gave evidence and went to the Secretary, and none of that was heard. And Robo-debt is a particularly vivid example, but I think in climate and in a number of areas of government policy, we're seeing this more and more. Public servants are not comfortable speaking up, and I don't blame them, because the laws aren't working and there's a real absence of support. Now, I often say to people, if tomorrow you saw something bad at work, where would you go? Right? If you're being underpaid at work, you can go to the Fair Work Ombudsman. If you're being discriminated against, you can go to the Human Rights Commission. if you want to blow the whistle, you've got nowhere to go. There are very few lawyers with this expertise, even fewer who will do it, without charging a fortune. So, I think our project, we're hoping to address that, but much more needs to be done. We need a whistleblower protection authority. The government's committed to a discussion paper on that. But I think some of these ideas, they're not far-fetched and fanciful. So, a whistleblower protection authority, they have one in the US. They incentivise people blowing the whistle with monetary rewards because of the toll it takes on people's careers. In the US, if you witness a company defrauding the government, you can actually just sue that company on the government's behalf. And the government can choose to take over the case or not. And if they don't, in any case, you get a cut of any fine levied. So in the US system, they've deputised lawyers to become anti-corruption hunters. And it's worked really effectively. We're talking billions of dollars in recovery by whistleblowers using whistleblowing law. Our schemes at the moment in Australia don't permit that, and I think that really needs to change. And I think the carbon credit context is a really good example where if people, dodgy carbon credits are a fraud on all of us, it's a great example where whistleblowers could supercharge an effective regulatory system. But at the moment, there is no dedicated scheme for carbon credit whistleblowers. There's, the laws that do protect them are weak. I think there's great potential to change and to empower whistleblowers to drive climate action, but we're not there yet.
We're going to go to questions from the audience very soon, so if people could make their way to the microphone if you have a question for our panel. We've got one microphone up here and another one over here. We'll get there very shortly. Ebony, Whealy, I wanted to ask you, coming back to the national anti-corruption body that we now have, and the ideas around transparency and accountability, and the way that one of the models, I guess, for that has been the New South Wales ICAC. And I know in the past, corruption around fossil fuel interests has been the subject of New South Wales ICAC investigations. How important is having a mechanism like that you described as a safeguard? How important is that to exposing publicly when wrongdoing happens in terms of restoring, I guess, trust that the process is working, I guess?
Well, when I retired as a judge almost 10 years ago, I wondered what I would do with my life. I hate golf, and if I can go one up on Monique, my favourite Mark Twain saying is, whenever I feel the need for robust physical exercise, I lie down till the feeling passes. So there I was. But I found an interest, and that was to advocate for a national anti-corruption commission. And I also took a job for a year on the New South Wales Anti-Corruption Commission. And I advocated strongly and have done for all those years, about 6 years. And so I'm committed absolutely to the value of this sort of body, and I'm particularly committed to the need to have, where it's appropriate, public hearings. I know this is a very controversial issue, and I know Chris Merritt would never agree with me, or most of the writers in the Australian newspaper, but I'm absolutely convinced that you need to have public exposure of corruption in order to be effective. And of course, regrettably, under the legislation passed in the federal parliament, public hearings can only be held in exceptional circumstances. And I think it's a great shame that limitation was suddenly foisted upon all the people who've been advocating for public hearings, and apparently with the full approval of the Labor Party, which had, after all, in its platform, espoused a body that would hold public hearings. And they now say, oh, well, it can hold public hearings, but I don't know what exceptional circumstances mean, but it's obviously meant to stop them. So, coming back to the heart of your question, in any issues involving the fraudulent use of offsets, and I'm sure that this will come up, then I think I'd be prepared to say, if I were the Commissioner, and happily I'm not, I'd be happy to say these are exceptional circumstances and go ahead and hold a public hearing and let them try and stop it.
After all, it's only the fate of the planet at stake, so what would be more exceptional than that? I think we've got some questions up here from the audience. So if we can
Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Richard Weller. I'm a structural engineer with expertise in measurement of extreme events and determining how we use those numbers to design structures for Australia. So my concern, and I'd like to thank all the speakers up till now, they've been very interesting. My concern is that you already alluded to some degree about the lack of education and the misinformation that abounds on climate. And even to the extent where, some people that I talk to, they just don't get what the consequences are really going to be. I mean, we're that close to 1.5. There's a whole string of tipping points that'll be unstoppable at that temperature. And people just don't understand that and what the implications are for the human community. So I suppose what I'm trying to get to is how do we, what's the panel's opinion on what the government ought to do to increase the level of understanding in the community? The reason we had elections the last time the way they were was because we had two really big incidents, the major bushfires that convinced people, and we're not seeing that change in opinion about climate. The fossil fuel industry are winning the war on education. So what would you have the government do?
Monique, I might throw that one to you first.
Thanks, Richard. Look, I think communication is absolutely key. It's so important, and there's been so much obfuscation and static in this space that good people are confused and they don't really understand it. And it really does come back to the government to provide the leadership with clear and coherent messaging that will take people along with them. I've been saying this about COVID as well. We need to be positive and give people a sense of hope, give them a sense of inclusion in the process. We're doing this together. Yes, it's hard, but it is doable. And we're going to do this, and this will be the outcome, and it'll be great because of not just for you, but for your kids. And yes, there'll be costs in the transition, but this is what we have at the end of it. Things will be cheaper and cleaner and better. People just don't understand that. I was reading the Australian this morning. There was an article about Andy McIntosh, and the comments are extraordinary. People still saying that don't you understand that carbon dioxide is good for us? We need some. It's like, oh my God. So you're never going to get everyone on around the table, but you just need enough of a majority that people feel comfortable and safe. But that involves trust, and to get trust, you have to have clear communication, and it's a challenge for the government. I think that we are in a much better place than we were 8 months ago. Let's face it, but there's a long way to go in that respect.
If I can just follow up, you said volunteers of your campaign were motivated by climate. Was it the Black Summer bushfires and some of those impacts that we are currently experiencing that really motivated people on your campaign, or different things?
There was a number of different things, and in fact in my first speech I mentioned the things that people told me that they cared about. They cared about this more being subjected to repeated once in a century events. They cared about the Black Summer bushfires. They cared about extreme weather events everywhere. I was really struck in Kooyong by the fact that people didn't vote for self-interest. If they had, they would have voted for the Liberal Party. They were voting for the rest of Australia on a whole lot of different events and a lot of things that they could see not affecting just themselves, but also the next generation and their grandchildren as well. And people are cumulatively aware of these, these extreme weather events. What's happening in New Zealand this week, you just go. People have this, and they have a sense of rising anxiety about it. But until perhaps recently, I think many of us felt that we didn't have a sense of agency. And some of us regained our sense of agency last year.
Kieran or Anthony, do you want to chime in with anything on
I mean, that's a great question. It's a complex answer involving sort of robust media ecosystems, regulation of social media platforms, etc. But I think it really underscores the need for truth and the need to empower truth tellers, because if we can get the truth into the world, people have to confront that. You're not going to change everyone's minds. There might always be some people who will unfortunately be influenced by the misinformation and disinformation. But if we empower truth, we do the best job we can of persuading people of the need for rapid climate action. I think all of the recent events have motivated a lot of people to go to Whistle. One person I know, person I provided some assistance to, was the Black Summer bushfires, and seeing the impact they were having that motivated them to speak up. And I'm sure we're going to continue to hear that tale, that what drives people to speak up about climate wrongdoing is the climate inaction and the disasters it's causing.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say from a practical point of view, you're not really going to get the best message from the government, I'm afraid, because of the conflicts that I've mentioned. But we've got the new independents. I only wish they had more time, because you are committed to this issue, and I think your voice in Parliament, just as Zali's who perhaps started it in some ways, I think that will be important. Keep that voice going. And then we've got the Australia Institute, after all. I mean, there's 300 people here. That's very encouraging. I mean, you should all get out and educate the community. That's what we really need to do. But it's a complex subject. And, but I think, as Polly said, it's complex, but it's simple, really, in a sense. The answers are simple. It's made complex by people, I think, really are trying to confuse us.
Yeah. What was that quote about? A very good way to hide evil is just to get in the middle of something complex.
Yeah.
If we've got the next question, over this side. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think actually my question is probably a really good follow-up to what was just touched on. So my name is Nicole Bray. I currently work for a state government, and Kieran, I'm really excited to hear about your initiative coming up. So I work in the carbon market space at the moment, but my question is actually more to do with community engagement. So basically, before I worked with the state government, I was really involved in community-led action, and still am. And one thing that has really come through as a theme, both with my volunteering work and in the state government, is the involvement of fossil fuel companies sponsoring to get social license. So from everything you would say, nippers, I think probably people have seen that, was very public recently, but even organisations like the WWF, I would say, in some ways very compromised, simply because the customers they have are giving them funding which was held back from government for a decade. So to my mind, we really have organisations who wouldn't like to take money from big sponsors, but with the way that philanthropy is, and also the way with very meagre government funding for community-led action, I feel that how do we enable community-led action to push back against the temptation to take money from the fossil fuel lobby? I think it really does muzzle people, and it's heartening to hear people for your campaign, Monique, saying climate, climate, climate. Unfortunately or fortunately, your electorate is very well off, and so can afford to do these things. And I know definitely there's people I speak to that would love to do more but feel they can't for financial reasons. So I'd love to hear your opinions on how to enable community people to resist fossil fuel lobby.
Kieran, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, great question. Multi-million-dollar question, I suppose. I think the greenwashing, the sports washing particularly by major fossil fuel companies is deeply problematic, particularly in sport, given the hold that sport has on Australian psyche, and that makes it harder, as you say, for whether it's arts festivals and grassroots communities that run festivals, the Santos Tour Down Under, the Adani, North Queensland Cowboys, and so on. That has a really corrosive impact, not only on the outfit, the festival, the sports team, but the community and the fans around them. You can see that at a totally different level in Newcastle, in England. The English Premier League team purchased by the Saudi investment fund, and the way that those fans have suddenly muted their criticism of Saudi's human rights record. And I think similarly, fans of, we've seen some very brave fans of clubs that are sponsored by large emitters speak up, but many more are concerned. What do we do about that? I don't really know. I think it was really heartening to see the Victorian government step in to sponsor the Australian netball team after Gina Reinhardt and Hancock Prospecting withdrew their funding. Gina Reinhardt's views on climate denial are well documented, and so Hancock Prospecting's funding of, for example, the Australian Olympic team, which is pledged to net zero and signed up to all sorts of green documents, and then takes large amounts of money from one of the most influential climate change deniers in Australia. Deeply alarming. How do we stop that? Well, I guess we empower fans to speak up and use their voice and use their movement and use their dollars, that also support these teams to try and shift the dial. That's not easy, but I guess that's what we have to keep doing.
Monique, we heard about kind of fossil fuel donations and sponsorship. You come from a medical background. We ruled out kind of tobacco advertising for health conferences and things a while back. Is it time we did the same with fossil fuels?
Oh, look, absolutely. And in fact, the medical industry has come a long way in that respect in recent years. When I first started practicing, conferences were very often sponsored by Big Pharma. They still are now, but there's much more implemented in that and way more rules around them. It was interesting last year, when we were new to Parliament, we were all invited to the Midwinter Ball, which is a social thing in Canberra, and it was sponsored by Woodside and Santos. And as a crossbench, we talked about whether we should go or not. Some of us did and some of us didn't. But the point was made that in WA you can't go to the opera unless you accept that it's been sponsored by Woodside. You can't go to the theatre. Every sporting event is, like everything is. So you can take yourself out of a huge number of things if you don't engage with that, if that's a blanket rule that that you just won't go there. I think there's an issue with capture. There's capture of our media. Barry Jones's recent book, he described one of my colleagues in Parliament as being a wholly owned subsidiary of Hancock Prospecting. There is too much coziness, there's no doubt about it. And the problem is you can't just, I don't think you should limit it to fossil fuels. I think that no political party or political entity should take donations from gambling companies or tobacco companies or fossil fuel companies. And the crossbench has got this incredibly long list of things that are going to come out. Online gambling, advertising of alcohol and kids, and fast foods to kids, and during evening hours. The list of things is incredibly long. So you're going to have to write in some more crossbenches. We can't do it all. But it's deeply problematic. It's entrenched at all levels of the society.
Anthony talked about donations,
sponsorship
in the same.
Well, it is really, but I mean, starting with political donations, we really need to transform that system. We really have to stop, put a cap on what people can donate, enlarge the definition of donations to make sure that you capture sponsorships and dinners and all that sort of thing. They're not covered now federally. And so, and we've got to stop, or put a really, at federal level, put a cap on what people spend in campaigns. We've got to make sure that whatever system we have encourages new independent candidates to come along. I'm not suggesting we don't do that for a minute. And we've got some thoughts on all of that. But that's what you've got to do in the political donation system. You've got to transform it and change it and stop the money coming in, the big money. More broadly, I'm not sure I really agree with Monique. I mean, in New South Wales, we banned donations from hotel interests and gaming interests. Strangely enough, we allow all the registered clubs in New South Wales to donate, all of which have poker machines. So that seems to be odd. But I wonder whether it's not better to transform the system, that is to cap the sort of money that can flow and to make it absolutely transparent. It's your ability to say, this function here, let's say, this we're all at today, is sponsored by Woodside. I mean, the fact that you know that and that you can make a point about the undesirability of that is maybe in some ways, some people would argue better than prohibiting money from inside. But sorry, everyone. Let the cat out of the bag.
I think we've only got time for 2 more questions, so we might take one from this side and one from this side, and then I think
thank you so much to all the speakers and panelists for sharing your time and insights, and thanks again to Auntie Violet for that wonderful welcome to Ngunnawal country. My name's Stephen Pfeiffer, and I'm a climate action donor and advocate, and also a member of a newly established group, Climate Capital Forum, spearheaded by the imperturbable Blair Pelosi from Epinvest, and includes members such as Tim Buckley from the Climate Energy Finance Group. We've heard some wonderful comments and insights regarding the lack of integrity in government policies, particularly the upcoming safeguard mechanism. There's been some excellent articles written by Richard, I've read, and also over at Renew Economy. But one element that seems to be lacking a little bit is, well, if there are so many problems with it, which there absolutely are, what does good, robust policy actually look like? What can we actually point to and say, this is what could be on the table, this is what we could put in place? Because I think that without that clear indication of what we could be doing or what's possible, or what best practice would look like, it's a bit harder to hold these existing policies to that absolute account. And I think it sort of works in the fossil fuel industries and potentially government's favour if that's not there as well. And particularly in the safeguard mechanism, that would be wonderful to see what that actually could look like.
Okay, what does good, robust climate policy look like? And the question from over here, please.
Hi, probably slightly different. I'm an academic working on carbon offset integrity. I'm Megan Evans at University of New South Wales in Canberra. And I guess just a couple of observations that come back to who is an expert and also the role of independent academics and researchers. Anyone can be an expert, I think, as Anthony highlighted, and it just seems that at the moment, who is an expert has been conflated to, if you have sustainability officer in your name on LinkedIn, you're apparently argued as credible as someone with 10 years of experience and a PhD on the topic, to the point where my colleagues have been derided as opinion holders and commentators. There's also no incentive for us as researchers and academics to comment really on public policy. We don't get promoted on it. It's nice to have, but we're promoted and we get to keep our jobs based on how much inaccessible and unreadable stuff that we publish in scientific journals. So it's a conundrum, it's a question. Well, it's not actually a question, it's just an observation to throw into the mix.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Monique, I might come to you on what good, robust climate policy looks like, and then Anthony and Kieran, back to you on the role of expertise. Monique.
So speaking as someone who's published more than 200 inaccessible scientific papers, I'm sorry, I'm not taking that up. Look, I don't know what really great climate policy looks like. That's a fantastic question. What I would say is, why don't you guys tell me? I'm here being reactive to pieces of legislation like the safeguard mechanism. What I'd love is for the people who are the experts and who know this stuff to build it together and then come to people like myself and take us through it and give us the, we have the ability to take things forward. I can tell you right now we don't have the ability to build really big pieces of policy like what you're talking about, but we'd love to work with people who can.
Also worth noting, we did have an effective climate policy and it did reduce emissions even while the economy grew, but Tony Abbott repealed it in a previous parliament. The role of expertise, Anthony.
Well, just before very quickly, but I sat next to Tony Abbott on the plane down yesterday, and I didn't talk to him. But I thought he'd be here. On the role of experts, look, I couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, experts are often chosen because they're going to express the opinions that those who engage them want to express. And yet there's this wealth of expert research, and that is wasted indeed, and which we never hear, and it's such a shame. I wish we could do something about it.
Kieran, any final observations?
I think in relation to what's good climate policy, I'm not a climate expert, so I won't comment, but I think we need to build integrity into the policy framework. So it's not enough to say, okay, we have integrity over here, we have climate policy over here. Every piece of climate infrastructure we're building, we need to be sure that we have robust and applicable whistleblower protections, oversights, inspector generals built into the system, ways and means for people to speak up about wrongdoing, so that we have a holistic approach and it's not just, the integrity stuff over the climate stuff. If we integrate them effectively, then both will be better for that.
And if I could throw in my 2 cents into my prerogative as chair, there's obviously a million different ways that you can implement a climate policy, but the pretty good standard is, does it actually reduce emissions? That's what it's supposed to do, right? So thank you very much for the questions from the audience, and please give our panel a round of applause. Thank you, Monique, Ryan, and Kieran. It's now time for lunch. It should be up here in the foyer, and don't forget the Queen's Terrace Cafe is open as well. We'll see you back here in an hour.